Tim is a guy who's filled with a lot of information, and he's got a lot of wonderful stories. And I wish we could have had him for a longer period of time. I know we had time constraints today, but what I took from that is he's got as somebody who came into the faith after his interest in science, he's familiar with the discomfort that comes when you realize that if you take Genesis literally or as history or as science, it's just not going to fit with reality. And so there's got to be some other explanation. And so I think he's patient and loving when it comes to being able to walk with somebody who's going through that. What were your thoughts, Kristine?
Well, one thing that I thought is he had a really great technique for dealing with the disconnect, is he just put it on the shelf for a while. He didn't let it derail either his faith or his pursuit of science, but he just kind of hung on to it and waited. And, there's some wisdom in that, and not just getting all bent out of shape until you know more.
Yeah, you're right. There's two other responses to that. One is to dismiss it, as a problem at all and pretend it's not, and try and just throw bad answers at good questions. And the other is to say, well, this obviously isn't what it says it is. It couldn't be written by God if it's this far off on geology and biology and so forth, and just completely walk away. Folks, I think you're going to love this interview. Tim Helble.
Today we welcome Tim Helble, who worked as a hydrologist in the National Weather Service for 27 years. For his first 4 years, he conducted river modeling and forecasting at the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center in Salt Lake City. And the remainder of his career was spent in the Washington, D.C. area, working on the modernization of the National Weather Service's hydraulic operations and services, and developing operational policy. Before his National Weather Service career, he held a half-year seasonal position at the Grand Canyon National Park, helping develop a water resources plan for the park. Thank you for joining us today, Tim. Great to have you here. So tell us a little bit about who you are. What's your background, both academic and spiritual, and what are you bringing into this conversation?
All right. I like that question, and you have to stop me if I go too long, because I tend to use too many words and go on a lot of tangents and stuff. So interrupt me if I'm going too long. I grew up in a mainline Presbyterian church, and it is located right near Los Angeles International Airport. When you're flying into Los Angeles, you look down, you're getting close to the runway, and you look down, you see the Rams Stadium, and you see the Forum, and you keep looking to the right, and there's this pretty large white church with a steeple on it. That was the church building that I practically grew up in, because my parents were very active in it. They were in the choir, and my dad did a lot of volunteer work there. He was an elder and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, going back to the 60s, of course, I was baptized as an infant there. I have no recall of that. The pastor there was this big, tall guy, about 6'5", and he had this really nice face. And I distinctly remember having a dream where I dreamed that God looked just like Pastor Stewart. And I always thought that was kind of funny that, that I guess that's kind of how kids process information, and during the 60s, I saw a lot of transformation in that community. It's in Inglewood, California, and it has about 100,000 people. And Inglewood went from 10% black and 90% white to the reverse in a few years. It went to 90% black and 10% white. And the church had to go through a lot of transformation. The pastor that I knew as a child left, he felt that there wasn't any chance the church would survive. A new pastor came in, and all this while I was going to Sunday school and had pretty good Sunday school teachers, very good, I think. And I remember asking questions. We talked about Noah's flood. You have those little Sunday school lessons where you have the giraffes kind of sticking their heads out of this tall boat, and they kind of water it down severely. But I also remember wondering, when we talked about Genesis 1 and 2, where was the Garden of Eden? I was very interested in maps, even as a little child. And the Bibles we had a map in the back, and I kept pressing the teacher on where was the Garden of Eden located. She didn't know. It's somewhere around there, in the Tigris Euphrates Valley, but we don't know where it is. So kind of at the same time, I did a lot of traveling with my parents, and I still remember when I was 6 years old, we went on a trip back to the Midwest to see my parents' mothers and fathers. And on the way, we went to Hoover Dam. We stopped at Hoover Dam. We did this is going from Los Angeles back east, and went into the visitor center. We did the tour of the dam, and I'm only 6 years old. We saw the movie they show there, where they show the construction of the dam. And I'll tie this in really quick. They showed the dam being made, the concrete being poured as a bunch of boxes in rows. And I was wondering, why didn't they just make one big mold for the whole dam and just keep pouring the concrete in there until it filled up to the top? And as a 6-year-old, I'm asking this question, and it really ties in with geology and stuff later on, because I found out much later, maybe 10 years ago, that if they would have poured the concrete in the Hoover Dam as one big mold, it would have still been drying to this day, and it would develop huge cracks, and it would be totally useless. It wouldn't be able to hold back any water. So I think I was bound to be a hydrologist right then. On the return trip, we were heading back from the Midwest, and we were driving on this little highway near the Colorado River below Hoover Dam. And I don't remember what highway number is or anything. And it was this little narrow slot canyon kind of place. And it had a little tiny narrow road. My dad's winding down this road, and we went around this one bend, and all of a sudden the rain just started to pour down, big drops, like that size on your windshield. And the visibility went from infinite to zero in 1 second. And I was just totally fascinated that a storm could be like that, because that's not the way it is in Los Angeles. A storm comes in, and it comes in a few hours, and it drops rain for 5, 8, 10 hours, maybe a day if you're lucky, and then it goes away very slowly. And if you're lucky, you got an inch of rain. Well, this thing that we went through near the Colorado River was like an inch of rain in a few minutes. Anyway, so that got me fascinated with the weather. And so those two factors I just kind of carried with me. When in the 4th grade, our teacher said you have to do a project for the whole year, or you have to write a book. So I wrote my book on rivers and dams, and I got an A on it, but I got a C- for handwriting, I remember. So, but I spent all this time in libraries researching rivers and dams and how high they are and how wide they are and different kinds of dams. And so that's kind of my background, at a young age. And I also remember, when I think I was around 12, my dad used to get a lot of things in the mail about different issues facing the church. And one of them was the creation story. And how do we tie that in with science? And this article I read said that, well, some people proposed that there was a gap in time between what you see in Genesis 1 and the rest of history. And so I thought, well, that makes sense. I guess I'll be a gap theorist, because I I don't see how all this could happen in a flash, in a matter of a few days. So I guess that's kind of what I carried around as my interpretation of Genesis 1 for many years.
You know, you mentioned something that I want to pick on for a second with you and then with Kristine. And that is that you mentioned as a young man reading Genesis, you were into maps at even that time, and you were trying to figure out where the Garden of Eden is. We see adults that still have that mindset about Genesis, and they're looking for the Ark on Ararat, and they're looking, maybe for, artifacts from the Old Testament to find those based on the same kind of understanding that you had as a young man of early Genesis. Now, my question to you is, isn't the young earth creationist right then to think that this was written as a literal historical narrative when you have literal historical points mentioned, like the Tigris, like the Euphrates? It's not describing Narnia, right? It's describing a Garden of Eden that seems to have historical points that draw you to a particular place on the globe, with actually names connected, like Adam and Eve and Noah and Nimrod in those first 11 chapters. So how is it that the argument has changed from, well, you shouldn't take it literally, maybe you understand it as in a different way? If I'm a young earth creationist and I'm listening to your story, I'm kind of shaking my head. Yeah, the Tigris, the Euphrates. I'm half Assyrian, and Assyria is mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. Why wouldn't I take this as historical narrative?
Should I go first then?
Sure.
Yeah. I guess I don't have any problem with it being a historical narrative. I would say that as a child, it never would have occurred to me that that the arguments made by the young Earth folks that the all those layers we see filling the Tigris Euphrates valleys were deposited by Noah's flood. I would just think of it as I just thought of it as something that happened on our landscape that we see today. We know those landmarks. I don't know if I'm really answering your question or not, but
no, that's Kristine, do you have anything to say to that?
Well, I think it's because to some extent as a kid, you aren't maybe as aware of different literary genres, especially genres that aren't commonly used today. The way the ancient Near Eastern people wrote about historical events or creation accounts isn't the way that we write today or really even think today. So especially as a child, as your brain is still developing and things are ever so much more black and white and literal and simplistic to kids, it just gets filtered in that way. Plus, I think the way kids are taught Bible stories, like Tim said, it's kind of a sanitized version. You aren't really getting all those details because, I mean, let's face it, we don't want to traumatize kids talking about everybody being killed in a flood. You might talk on God judging sin, but it's kind of a brutal story too. So I think as we grow up and we learn to process different literary genres and see different clues in the text, we ought to adjust our thinking to hold a more faithful view of those passages. I didn't mean to throw you all off.
I know we have a list of questions we want to get in. I just I found your story fascinating, Tim, and I just wanted to take a short detour. So, Kristine,
that's okay. So yeah. I guess I could keep going with the story a little bit.
Sure.
Maybe a lot more. The church I grew up in, like I said, was a mainline Presbyterian church, and we had some. I noticed even as a child, we had some people in the church that were really into Jesus. They were really into him in a personal way. And then I noticed some other people that were there more as good, as viewing the church more as just a place for good social activities and good fellowship. And during that time that the church went through this, or the community went through this transition, all of the people, basically, it seemed to me that all the people that were, I guess as I thought of it as a child, they were into Jesus, they left. And then a lot of some other people came in that were interesting. They had causes and stuff, but they weren't. They didn't seem to have much of or at least express a relationship with Jesus the way that some of my Sunday school teachers did. And I just kind of tucked that away in my brain and thought about it often. And then I guess fast forward to the late 60s and 70s. That was the Jesus movement time. And I started running into people all over the place, especially near the beach. For some reason, when you go to the beach, that was where the Jesus people hung out. And you could kind of see them. You'd be walking down the street, and you'd see this guy just kind of standing around, and he had a book in his hand, Like, oh, no, it's a Jesus freak. And then you kind of, oh, maybe I'll go in this store and go shopping or something, and, just do stuff to get away from them, because they had this message that was a little bit unsettling that I hadn't really been confronted with in my church. And it had to do with sin and Christ dying for my sins. And I thought that was it was a challenging time for me, because I grew up in this church, and I thought, well, isn't that what it means to be a Christian, And these people were telling me that, well, there's something more involved. There's a commitment involved here that is it's not just like joining a club. And so I kept running into people like this, Jesus people, in high school, and then in community college, and then I went to UCLA, and I think what started to make sense was one of these people put me on the mailing list for Billy Graham, his crusade, and I started receiving a lot of materials, and I think that it started to click with me. I could see my sin, and I could see my need for a savior, and so I like to I tell people that when I decided that maybe I will be a serious Christian. It was Income Tax Day in 1978, that April 15th, and but during this time, I also had this unsettling struggle going on between if I want to be a Christian, a full-fledged Bible-believing Christian, what do I do with Genesis? Early chapters of Genesis. How do I sort of reconcile the two? And the way I recall thinking about it, I decided just to set it aside and not really make a decision like I'm gonna take everything literally wooden literal translation kind of approach to Genesis. I'm looking at Jesus and looking at God's grace, and that's what I'm going to focus on, and I'll figure out this other stuff some other time. So I guess that's kind of the way I am. I stayed with that sort of approach, that it wasn't a critical salvation issue for me that the earth had to be created in 6 literal days, and Noah's flood had to wipe out everything and basically rework the whole planet's geology. That that didn't make any sense to me.
So as a very young man, you knew you were interested in the sciences because you were asking those questions as when you saw the Hoover Dam and when you saw the rain at the Colorado River. You're asking these questions, and then later, gradually, you were attracted to at least the person of Christ, if not Christianity. And you notice, though, that there is some kind of conflict or some kind of maybe contradictions or paradox with Genesis. Yeah. You set it aside. Tell us how you came to the point where, I mean, my co-host, Kristine, has bought your book, I think, 11 times.
Thanks,
and she's passed it around. We've had a number of the authors on our show. It's a very popular book. It's filled with good information and wisdom. How did you come around to putting this together? So take us from that moment where you set Genesis aside to now where you're actually involved in trying to fix some of the damage that young Earth creation has done.
Oh, good question. Let's see. I went to graduate school after finishing at UCLA. I started at UCLA as a meteorology major, atmospheric science, and it was heavily theoretical at UCLA. So I ended up changing my major because I was always interested in hydrology anyway. I told the counselor there in the department, that's really what I'm interested in. So I went over to the geography department, and that's where the hydrology was. At least the kind of hydrology I liked, with flumes and stuff where you run water down a large, basically a large sandbox, and then you observe bed forms forming in the channels and stuff. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Arizona, and it was interesting there that I noticed in hydrology there, it seems like there's a lot of Christians in this department. It's kind of interesting, it must have something to do with Noah's flood. That was kind of my pat answer. And one day my advisor comes down the hall. I think it was 1983. The semester had just finished, and he says with his New York accent, "Hey, I got a job for you." I go, "Yeah? What kind of job?" He says, I lined up a job for you at the Grand Canyon. And wow, I always wanted to work at the Grand Canyon. It's like 2-3 weeks later, I had already it was a government job. I was hired, and I packed up my car, and I went up there, and I started working as a hydrologist, developing a water resources management plan. And I ran into I started going to Grand Canyon Baptist Church, and I ran into some really neat people there. And I started to look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, and I started wondering, could these really have been deposited by Noah's flood? And I kind of decided, well, maybe it was, but it didn't seem like it was very likely. And I went back to after I finished that job, 6 months, went back to Tucson, and I was in this young adult group there in my church in Tucson. And one Wednesday night, this guy comes, he's a member of the group. He'd gone off to the Institute for Creation Research, and he'd done a 2-week course in creation science. And he gave us a talk. He knew everything about planetary geology in a 2-week course. And so that got me really interested in the controversy. I think I kind of set the whole issue aside again for quite a while. In the 90s, late 80s and 90s, I got actually a form of bone cancer, and that became issue number one. And I just kind of set everything else aside, and kind of you had to dedicate your life to fighting. And so after that, I think it was 1994. One of the guys in my Bible study said, "Let's go to this Ken Ham. This guy named Ken Ham is coming to town. They're doing this creation seminar at this local church in the Baltimore area. So I went to that, and that got me really interested in the issue again, because they had a book table in the back, and I bought this book called Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe, and I started scanning in that, and I had it open about 30 seconds, and I could already find some problems that I recognized from just being a hydrologist. So that got me interested in the subject again, and I don't know. I better let you ask another question there, because I mean a lot more will come out of that as we keep talking, I'm sure.
Okay, so what was your role in the project on this monument to ancient Earth instead of the monument to catastrophe? What was your role, and how did that come about?
That was cool. I had been kind of ramping up my interest in the issue over the early 2000s, and I developed this PowerPoint presentation. I just started adding stuff to it to kind of organize my thoughts, and it got to be over 100 slides long. And then I joined this group called the American Scientific Affiliation, and I started getting their perspectives on science and Christian faith publication, which comes out once every 3 months. Then there was this article by Carol Hill that was called, I forget the exact title. It was looking at the Grand Canyon and young Earth creationism, and it was just looking at the claims and addressing them with the science that we see in the Grand Canyon, the observations. And I thought I saw there was something in Carol's paper. Carol and Steve. I noticed you just did Steve Mosher the other week also. He and Carol wrote this paper, and there was something in there. I had a question about it, and so I emailed Carol. And this was June of 2009. And I know this differs from Carol's account that she wrote up later on, but I've got the emails to back it up. It was June in 2009. I asked her a question, and she answered that with an email back. And then I said, would you take a look at this presentation that I developed? Just curious to see what your comments are. So I sent it to her. A couple days later, she says, lots of interesting stuff in there. You put a lot of work into this thing. And then she said, I've been thinking about working on this, developing a book on the Grand Canyon, and I haven't really talked to anybody about it yet, but would you be interested in working on it? So I said, yeah. So then she copied Steve Mosher on that, and Steve was, of course, really interested and then she gradually added on other people. And my role was, I think I had 3 or 4 roles, actually. One was to be the expert on what young Earth creationists are saying about the Grand Canyon, to be the one that makes sure that we get their position right. And so if there's an error, if somebody's saying that we misconstrued the young Earth creationist, the flood geology view on the Grand Canyon, then I guess you have to blame me for not getting it corrected. I tried to make sure that everything we had lined up with what they were saying, and we think we did a pretty good job of that. But if there's anything that they say that I got wrong, then, or that the book got wrong, then it's really on me. What's some other roles I had? Graphics. We were starting to develop some chapters in 2011, and Carol would say we need a graphic to show something or other, and so the first one I did was this figure. I think it's called Figure 2-3, the one with the big Grand Canyon strata that shows the Grand Canyon and the Grand Staircase strata. And so I started. I was teaching myself how to use a graphics program, and so I started drawing one up. And Carol said, "Hey, this is pretty good. We could use you to do the graphics in the book, and we could save us a lot of money." And so I kind of got drafted into doing graphics for the book, and that was hard work. That some of them took a long time to develop, and all of them took a long time, but some of them took a really long time. And so that was that was one of my roles. And another one was just to write a couple chapters. And of course, one of them was the chapter 3, the one where we, there it is. Yeah, that chapter I basically drafted, and then Carol added a few things in once in a while. And I also did chapter 16, the one that introduces carving of the Grand Canyon. I did the first draft of chapter 19, and it also served as kind of as an editor for the text in all those chapters to make sure that the authors accurately reflected the young Earth position. And and then the other role I had was photos, being the photo editor, one of two. Fortunately, it was really a great move that Carol made by contacting Wayne Ranney, because he basically works in the Grand Canyon. He does tours and he does hikes, and he's a great guy. And so she drafted him, and then I got the job as a co-photo editor, and Wayne knows a lot of the big time photographers of the Grand Canyon. So he sent out this letter to about 20 of them, and he said, "Would you guys be willing to consider contributing photos to the book?" And we could probably provide a nominal fee, but we can't provide like a full $500 per photo kind of thing like most photographers would get for contributing. So it was kind of enlisting them as volunteers. And then my job as photo editor would be to line up all the other ones. People would write drafts of chapters, and then they would paste in a photo, like a low-res photo, and I'd have to run down the guy that took it, or the woman that took it, and see if I could get the highest resolution possible. And that was a heck of a time, sometimes finding them, and then a lot of times they didn't know who took it. So I had to do a lot of searching. I'd find it. Some of them I found myself. I just was looking around the web, found like a photographer in Australia that took a great picture of some stromatolites. And so those are kind of my 4 big roles in the book, I guess. So sorry, I ran on a little long there.
That's really interesting. Now, I hear that Answers in Genesis has recently reviewed your books. Do you have any comments on their review? Did they complain that you misrepresented them, or were their complaints different?
Well, we'll backtrack a little bit, but back to 2016 when we wrote the book, I decided we ought to have a list of the main points in the book compiled. So I went through all the chapters, and I came up with this list that had 177 main points in the book. And so CMI, Creation Ministries International, came out with a review, I think in 2017, or maybe it was late in 2016. I don't remember. That's when I decided I should, before I even read the CMI review, I should come up with a list of main points. Then we could compare, see if the reviewers are actually addressing the main points or not. Anyway, fast forward to this recent review of the Answers in Genesis. I looked at the document that they produced, and I thought this would be interesting to see how many of the main points of the book that they address. And then I was really surprised. I started scanning through. I wasn't reading like from start to finish, and I still haven't read the whole thing yet. But it was, 68 pages long or 64 or something, like somewhere in the 60 pages, and they only addressed chapters 1, 2, and 20, and a little bit of bits and pieces of other chapters. So that was the first thing I noticed, that they produced this thing that's 60 some pages long, and they've only addressed a fraction of the main points that the book has. Another thing that struck me was that young Earth creationists want to view science as a fixed collection of facts that don't change. And I'm just a science communicator, really. I haven't published a lot in hydrology journals or anything like that. But they want to view science as something that doesn't change. When a scientist says something, and then or they place a date, for example, on a layer in the Grand Canyon, and then later on that date gets refined. They go, aha! That shows that science is deficient. It doesn't have all the answers. But that's not the way science works. Science is it's self-correcting. It revises itself when new information comes along, and it struck me that's the way they want to view science. Another thing was, let's see, I have some of the stuff here written down. Just an example of that, there was this diagram that I developed for the Grand Canyon book that page 41 that just shows the geologic column for the Grand Canyon. Let's see, how do I get that show there? There we go. And so Terry Mortensen wrote that. So Hill and everyone says that it's trustworthy scientific fact that the horizontal layers represent 225 million years. We didn't say that it's a trustworthy fact. We just presented the data the latest available dates that are there. And when we write something like that, when a scientist writes something like that, they understand that there's gonna be revisions in that. So that kind of struck me as odd. And then I saw stuff that I still hadn't read the whole thing, but there was something that was written on page 271 where it said, then they say some young Earth advocates write that the natural laws in the whole universe are a consequence of God's curse or punishment for the fall. That's what we wrote in the Grand Canyon book. And Dr. Mortensen said then, while it may be true that someone has made such an outrageous statement, I know of no creationist who would ever suggest such a statement is true. So I thought, well, we must have had some kind of Greg Davidson wrote that sentence. So I started looking in Answers in Genesis website, and it said, I found this article that's from 2013 that it basically said that I can't seem to find it here. Basically, it was an article in Answers in Genesis website that talked about how Henry Morris said that the second law of thermodynamics was a result of the curse of the fall. And it was an article by Danny Falconer of Answers in Genesis, and so there you have like the founder of the modern young Earth creation movement. Henry Morris was saying that the second law of thermodynamics probably didn't come into play until after the fall. So it just didn't make sense to me that they would say something like that.
So tell me a little bit about sedimentary transport rates. What are they, and have you done any quantitative computations on them?
Yeah, that goes back to my about 2009, 2010 or so. I started getting interested in that because, like I said earlier, I'd always sort of been on the fence. Well, maybe it's possible that Earth's sedimentary record was deposited by Noah's flood, but I thought, well, how do I figure that out? Then I got this idea that, well, sometimes like the young Earth creationists give volumes for different rock formations and sedimentary formations, and I did an article for the ASA's, the American Scientific Affiliation's journal, on the Coconino Sandstone, and I looked at, well, if that whole layer, if that whole formation was deposited in a matter of days, as the young Earth people are saying, then what would the sediment transport rate have to be in order to accomplish the feat? And so I just started looking at the math of. They said that and Steve Austin said in the Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe that the volume of the Coconino Sandstone was 10,000 cubic miles. And anyway, to make a long story short, if you want to look at the rates that sediment would have to move from one area to another, there's another one that I did later on, but we'll get to that in a minute. But just to deposit the Coconino Sandstone in a matter of days would take like a continuously moving slab of sand moving into the area of the Coconino Sandstone. It wouldn't be, as they were depicting it, as sand, underwater sand dunes with sand grains being kind of blown off the top of the dune, and settling on the other side, and then the dune kind of moves along, and then you keep doing that. I found that it would actually, at the rates that they were citing, at the rates, I shouldn't say that they were citing, they used a secular, I use that word secular, I'm sorry, a research paper done by a sedimentologist where he provided some graphs of sand waves at the bottom of the Golden Gate in the San Francisco Bay, the narrow neck of the San Francisco Bay. And he provided also some flume, some studies from flumes, which is basically like I said, a giant long sandbox where you run water downhill and you watch the sand moving as the water passes over it. Anyway, he compiled a lot of this data, and in his paper he had one graph that was never used in the younger circles that actually had these numbers on it. And I thought, what are these numbers? These numbers are sediment transport rates in grams per second per length of line that the sand is crossing. And so I started doing the math of, well, if that's, they're saying that the Coconino Sandstone was formed as underwater sand waves, it would take over 500 years to transport enough sand to deposit 10,000 cubic miles of sand in the Coconino Sandstone's area. And then I started realizing that they're not just off by a little bit. It's not just a matter of putting on your biblical glasses and seeing things biblically. It's just like many orders of magnitude off. It's just tremendous. So then, if you put up that other graphic you were showing there a minute ago with the boxes on it. So recently, I was trying to think about, well, the whole Colorado Plateau is sedimentary rock, and what would the sediment transport rates have to be to do that, to deposit the whole plateau in a matter of 1 year? And so what you're showing now shows what the sediment transport rate would have to be in order to deposit the whole Colorado Plateau in 224 days, basically during the flood year. The young Earth folks say that the deposition was pretty much over 50 days into the flood. Some say 224. That shows a 77-foot high wall of sand moving at 16 miles per hour, and that would have to keep burying 12,875 football fields every 16 seconds for 224 days in order to move enough sand into enough sediment into the Colorado Plateau. And that doesn't say anything about what kinds of sediment there's layers that are limestone, there's layers that are sandstone, there's siltstone, mudstone, there's layers that alternate back and forth between different things, different kinds of sediment grains. And so that's what I got was um, 77 foot high wall of sand. So how are you going to get all the detail that we see in the Colorado Plateau? How are you going to get all the fine detail that we see all through the area? Like the graphic you showed a minute ago with it showed a lot of different. It showed the Grand Canyon on one side and the Grand Staircase, and it shows, you can look at the legend there, all the things that are part of this one little thin slice of 75 feet of sediment at this one site on the east side of St. George, at a place they call Johnson Farm. That has no relationship to the Johnson I'm talking to in here, but it is fascinating to me that you have dinosaur tracks in about 20 or so different layers in that 75 feet of sedimentary rock. You have fish, you have dinosaurs, you have and the kicker was that you have prints of dinosaurs sitting down and resting, because you can see their basically their behinds are made an imprint on the sand where they were sitting. And so you look at things like that, and that's not just an isolated place. They're finding footprints all through the Colorado Plateau. In fact, I've got one book that I'm reading where the author it says that they find a new site with footprints every week in the Colorado Plateau, and so you look at that site in St. George. It's unfortunate now that it's getting suburbanized. There's a strip mall covering up part of the area, and they're grading another area for houses, and there's this one building where they have this dinosaur discovery site where you can go and look at the findings. And fortunately, this Andrew Milner, the guy that this is the chief scientist of the place, he got to do a lot of surveying and cataloging of all the different things in this 1 square mile area surrounding the site before it got all developed and everything. But well, that's basically it. There's so much detail in these individual sites all through the Colorado Plateau. How could they form? They can't form when you have sediment transport rates at the rate that I showed in that graphic. When you have you have to have a wall of sand moving at the speed of the fastest running back in the country, continuously for 224 days. You can't have both.
Sounds like young Earth creationists have proposed possibilities that aren't really very realistic. What are some of the tactics that young Earth creationists have been using?
Well, back when I was young, the tactics were pretty much entirely consisted of what I call young Earth proofs. The things that like there's not, if the sea is really old, there's not enough salt in the sea to it's not possible to have for the salinity level in the sea to be what it is if the oceans are millions of years old. This book, this is one that I got when I was a new Christian that my cousin gave to me. The Genesis flood. That was kind of a lot of young Earth proofs in there. A lot of quotes of they take a quote of somebody, a scientist, that the scientist says something like cosmic dust is accumulating at such and such a rate, so therefore the moon should have had like foot upon foot of dust when the astronauts set foot on it, but when they stepped into it, it just left a footprint, like a little bit of a soft layer at the top. But yeah, so they do a lot of arguments where they take a statement that some scientist made, and then they run with it and then say, well, that shows that the Earth couldn't possibly be young if this statement is true. And you see lists of them they produce. There's one that has like 100 reasons why the Earth has to be young. And more recently, though, I think they've realized that the young Earth proof method wasn't working too well, because books started coming out where they just listed the young Earth proofs and then refuted them, and then you could buy these things. There was one I have called the Counter Creationist Handbook, and all they did was list out the young Earth claims and then provide a page or two where they explain why they're nonsensical. Anyway, so now they're getting more into they're trying to do research, at least some of them on specific sites. They're really focusing on the Coconino Sandstone, and they're trying to find evidence that water was involved in parts of the Coconino Sandstone. And so they're trying to do more science. They get students to go to the Geological Society of America and present posters, and they do little things like that. And they've published a few papers that have made it into the scientific journals. And they're getting better at
they also make homeschool curriculum, art parks, and lately they've been making some movies with pretty good production value. I mean, the production value has really been stepped up by Answers in Genesis and some other groups. Tim, I'm wondering if I could show you a clip from a movie where they have Andrew Snelling talking about the Grand Canyon, and I was wondering if you could maybe watch the clip and then comment afterward. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Here it is.
These layers go for mile after mile after mile. Take the Coconino Sandstone. We can trace it from here, right across New Mexico, Colorado, right over towards Kansas and Oklahoma, or even in Texas. We're talking at least 200,000 square miles for this one rock unit that's consistent for mile after mile after mile. That's not the scale that we see today with localized sedimentation. And to get it flat lying like this over such a large area, it's like you have to make your pancake all at once very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And so these layers show evidence of rapid sedimentation.
Well, Andrew, the Coconino Sandstone is a big issue because the conventional paradigm has for years said that this was formed in dry conditions.
Yes, it's given as the textbook example, and it's held to tenaciously that the Coconino Sandstone formed in a dry desert sand situation. If we look closely, for example, at the Coconino Sandstone, we see within the horizontal layer, we see the bedding, that there's bands within it that are sloping. Mm-hmm. We call those cross beds. And what they indicate is that you had underwater sand waves were moving along. The comparison is in a desert. Most people understand a desert with a sand dune and the wind blowing the sand forward. Well, underwater, we see the same thing, sand waves. And so the water current is rapidly moving it along, and what we get left behind are these front-facing slopes. And we can estimate the depth of water, the speed of the water current, and we can do this with a Coconino Sandstone. In actual fact, it's important to recognise that there's a difference in the angle in a desert dune. It's usually 30 to 34 degrees of these sloping beds. Whereas underwater, it's usually 25 degrees or less. And in the Coconino Sandstone, these cross beds are always 15 to 25 degrees. Now, we've examined this issue extensively. Steve Austin's student, Dr. John Whitmore, has combed the hills around here with his students, hundreds and hundreds of measurements of these cross beds. And they all come in the range of 15 to 25 degrees, which is right where it should be with a underwater sand deposition.
Just wondering if you could comment on that. It seems like pretty strong evidence that they're presenting there.
Well, right at the end there, he says the layers, the cross beds are always 25 degrees or less. And I was scratching my head about that. Why is he saying that? Because if you look at John Whitmore's graph in a paper that I can just hold it up there for a second and you can see it. He's got at the end here, he's got a bunch of crossbed angles that are greater than 25 degrees. He's got ones that are 26, 27, 28. He's even got some beds that they measured at 32 degrees. So I don't know why Snelling is saying that they're always 25 degrees or less. That struck me as one. I mean, one thing that he's not apparently reading I just wonder if he's reading what the other young Earth creationists are saying. The other thought I have I have a lot of thoughts about Coconino Sandstone, but he talks about how vast they are, how big and widespread these layers are. There's a couple of problems with that. The one thing I found was when I was doing sediment transport rate computations, just looking at the average sediment transport rate, the bigger the volume of sedimentary rock you want to attribute to Noah's flood, the bigger the volume, the more astronomical the sediment transport rates are that are required to deposit that volume during the flood year. So that seems to be one of the big trends now, is to show these transcontinental sequences. The younger folks are really expending a lot of effort to identify these sequences and attribute them to various stages of Noah's flood. And it's just when you look at the sediment transfer rates that are required to accomplish that, they just get so astronomical. Astronomical is not even a good word to use. It's just like off the scale.
I hate to put you in this position. Of course, I'm the one who puts people in uncomfortable positions on our show.
That's your job, right?
So I have to ask you, the lay Christian who's a young Earth creationist and watches his Genesis history or reads these young Earth creationist books, it's hard to hold them accountable. They don't have the background that you do or that the people writing the books have in the science and in the field. But is there some sense to you that, and I'm not saying, I'm not trying to make a point about any particular voice in particular. I know that they're probably all just wonderful Christian brothers who are trying to do their best. But is there some point when you hear things that are twisted or that are construed maybe with an obvious confirmation bias, that you hold the leaders of the movement to higher account? Is there some sense that there's a degree of at least deception going on in what they share and what they don't share and how they share it?
Yes, there has to be some accountability there. I mean, one thought I have is that we need to have more discussions when you get people on both sides of this issue participating. And it's hard to line those up. It has been done. I've been to some, two different evangelical theological society meetings. There have been sessions where they had, say that the first one I remember was Greg Davidson, one of the authors of the Grand Canyon book, the editor, and Marcus Ross, I think it was. Now I can't remember who he was. I guess it was Andrew Snelling also. Yeah, it was Dr. Snelling. And we have to have those kind of things where you can present this both sides to a group of people. But even when you go to one of those, you're just talking about pretty accomplished theologians attending these things. You don't have the the rank and file Christians at these things. They're kind of the top of the cream of the crop sort of theologians at these seminars. But it would be great if you could have some kind of thing like that gets widespread viewership. But it takes a lot of money to produce. It'd be really great if we could produce an alternative movie to this Genesis history to explain some of this stuff, to explain the conventional geology model to people and why the young Earth leaders are incorrect. But it's hard because one thing that makes it really difficult is as soon as you get into trying to explain something about why crossbed angles are the way they are in the sand dune versus underwater sand dunes, and the arrangement of underwater dunes versus configuration of surface dunes. And getting into the science, most people just kind of like lay their eyes. As soon as you start talking about science, they that's just our human nature. We like short, sweet answers. We don't like the complex stuff. Yeah, you're really getting into human psychology there. I don't know if I can really explain it. Well,
speaking of complex stuff, you've spent a good portion of your career working for the National Weather Service. Forecasting the weather is pretty complex too. Could you just tell us a little bit about what goes into forecasting, and are forecasts getting more accurate or better over time?
Oh boy, that would take forever. Let's see. I'll see if I can do it in a few minutes. Yes, they are getting better. When you take meteorology, they start you at, I guess people call it now Meteorology 100. As a meteorology major, you wait a whole year before you take this class because you got to get a year of calculus under your belt. They start throwing up equations on the board that explain things like planetary waves and why the atmospheric pressure decreases exponentially with height. All this stuff is really complicated math. So if you want to forecast the weather, it used to be that you just kind of looked at, in the 1800s, you looked at reports that were received from other parts of the country, and you noticed, it's a lot colder out west. There must be a cold front coming. And, that's kind of how they did it in the old days. And then in the 1900s, mid-1900s, they started developing technology where you could plot a weather map on a large piece of paper and put it in a facsimile machine and then send it out to other places. And then people could see, the forecasters could see where the fronts were and what changes were coming down the pike. And then they started running models. And what a model is, you take these equations that they teach you in meteorology school, and then you take a bunch of other ones that you don't get until you're in the PhD program, and you simulate the physics of the atmosphere with in these models, and you divide up the atmosphere into little boxes, parcels they call them in meteorology, that are like above the ground at some height z, and each parcel has a certain volume, and then you have to apply these laws of physics to each parcel, and the transfers of energy they're going into and out of it. And if you start making these parcels pretty small, you got to get a supercomputer in order to run the model. And they are really, the math will just curl your hair. It's just,
Tim,
it's so complicated.
In the discussion of let's say weather and climate, where do you see Christians going wrong in the same way as they go wrong with the understanding of the age of the earth and so forth and Noah's flood? I mean, the dismissal of climate science is also a typical reaction from a corner of the room at the Christian table, and a suspicion of people like you and of climate scientists like Catherine Hayhoe, who says, no, anthropogenic global warming is real. We see it. And how do you respond to that?
Yeah, boy, great question. There's a couple of aspects that come into play. I think one of them, it's almost like we're getting into politics almost, but it's kind of like when we were going to school, when there were kids in our class that were whiz kids, and the teacher hands back the quiz, and the whiz kid always gets 100, and I think people develop sort of a resentment against smart people because of that, and I think that's just one aspect of it's part of our sin nature, we resent people that are smarter than us. So here you have these climate scientists that are saying, what you've been doing isn't good for the planet. So there's this smart person that is telling me that I'm a bad person, and that's just one aspect of it, I think. It's the complexity of the science that's a factor. It involves stuff that most people just don't have a way to comprehend, and all science, I think, gets tied in by Christians with evolution. It's that's kind of an anathema. Like a pastor in my old church in Tucson was saying, well, maybe the Earth is old, but just don't accept that evolution. And it was really it was crystallized in a video I saw on there was a PBS show called Now, and they were talking. The subject was God and global warming, and so they were. This guy named Richard Cizik, that you're probably aware of, he arranged this trip to bring a bunch of pastors up to Alaska to show them the impacts of global warming. And so they were just this one. It was one of the Christians that came along on the trip, and they were interviewing her, and she says, "Well, we just don't trust science because you guys believe in evolution." And I thought, wow, that's like she just hit it right there, and then nail on the head. They don't accept the climate science because it's in their minds it's linked up with evolution. It's the same people that are pushing evolution are the same ones that are pushing climate science. They're the same ones that are pushing an old Earth. So it all gets kind of rolled up into one ball and rejected,
They're the same ones that are pushing a mask and social distancing and a new vaccine. So I mean, let's kind of tie this up with the final question. I hear that you talk about wrestling with these topics growing up and having to put things on a back shelf for a while because you didn't maybe have the right tools to process the science with your Christian faith. What would you hope for students today that their youth pastors or youth leaders would do within the church to help Christian students, young people, even adults, wrestle with these areas without losing their faith and still being able to integrate what we know about reality and that these, transport rates for creating the Coconino Sandstone, just that the young Earth model just doesn't work, and the old Earth model really seems like it explains it well, and we see time and time again that the science has matured to be able to explain things very well, and yet there's this skepticism amongst the church. What would be your just top recommendation for leaders within the church when talking about science and faith?
Yeah, well, as a new Christian, I felt going back, thinking about back in the 80s and 90s, that I needed to be able to develop an answer to every every problem that pops up in Scripture, and we have to. I developed this mentality that we have to have an answer to every question. And I got these books, the Gleason Archer's book, when critics ask, and or maybe one was Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, where they list out these scriptures and the questions that are asked about it, and here's the answer. Here's why the Bible still is reliable. Youth pastors, I think have to convey to the young people that it's okay not to have the answer to everything. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I think they need to make it clear that that's okay. It's okay not to be able to reconcile evolution with the words in Genesis 1 and 2. It's okay if it's okay if Noah's flood didn't completely rework the planet's geology. I can't really point him to like one resource or something like that. I guess I would say I wish that every church library had the Grand Canyon book.
Tim, tell us what's been your greatest adventure?
Greatest adventure. Well, it'd be that this hike that I did at the Grand Canyon. I was working at the Grand Canyon back in 1983, and my coworker, fellow hydrologist, said, "Let's go to Blue Springs." And we had been researching it. We were tallying all the springs in the Grand Canyon and trying to get data like the average water flow and things like that. We knew all the data on this thing, but we wanted to see it ourselves. So he had a Jeep car. We drove across part of the Navajo Reservation, got up to the edge of the Grand Canyon, but actually it's the Grand Canyon of the Little Colorado River. And I looked over the edge. I sent you a slide showing a scene or two on there. And I looked down and I go, what have I got myself into? It was a drop off. There wasn't a trail to speak of. It was a drop off of about 1,000 feet into this side canyon. And you just kind of scrambled along the cliff for about, a mile or two. And I had a backpack on because we wanted to spend our night down there, and it had a frame on it. And you get to this one place where you have to hand your pack around this, we call it the beak. And there has to be a guy that got around there on the other side without a pack on. If you fall, it's like 500 feet down. And I don't like heights. Oh yeah, there you see the picture. If you look in the middle of that, at the end of the hike, well, obviously I survived because I'm here. If you look right in the middle of that picture on the left, you can see like a guy in a red shirt and a couple other people. If you really look closely, those are little tiny people, and they're handing their packs around on the beak right there. Anyway, I got down to the bottom and saw this beautiful blue water come out of the rocks there, and it was 72 degrees and perfectly clear, but it had this blue cast to it, and it was just great for swimming. It was hot. It was Memorial Day, and we just had a great time. So that was my biggest adventure. We got to see what Blue Springs was. It wasn't just on paper anymore. It was. We actually got to really see it. So that was my greatest adventure, I think, because I was forced into something that I really don't like to do, which is get up really high on a cliff and and make my way down.